I myself think that one of the ways forward is through not emphasizing so much that it's all about belief, because I don't think it's all about belief. I think it's all about practice, which is why I've written my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, and its sequel, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. Both books are about spiritual practices, and what they show is that scientific research has shown that a whole range of spiritual practices make people happier, healthier, and live longer. They're good for you. So spiritual practices like fasting, prayer, meditation, the practice of gratitude, singing and chanting with other people, taking part in rituals, going on pilgrimages, connecting with nature, all these kinds of practices give people a greater sense of connection and therefore a greater sense of belonging and a more satisfying life, less sense of alienation, disconnection, separation, and all the things that underlie so much modern mental problems, especially depression.
I think, Rupert, that somewhere in it you say that atheism should come with a health warning.
Yes, well, at least militant atheism, because insofar as militant atheism alienates people from their traditional religious practices, it really does cause health problems, because, if spiritual and religious practices make people happier, healthier, and live longer, for which there's a huge amount of evidence, then lack of these practices makes them less healthy, live shorter, and less happy. So that's why I think it really should come with a health warning. The problem is that most educated people have been filled with this Enlightenment agenda, which is hard baked into the educational system, which is that to be an atheist, or at least an agnostic, means that you're smarter than people who have any kind of religious faith. They've been bamboozled, duped, they're credulous, feeble-minded, etc. Whereas we who believe in science and reason have risen above all that, seen through it, and we're smarter. And most people undergo that kind of transition as a teenager if they've been brought up in a religious family. And I meet endless people who say, I saw it through it all when I was about 14 and, I just saw through it. And they are rather proud of the fact that at 14, they absorbed a kind of cultural norm of the educated classes. They think it shows they're smarter than everybody else. So anyway, I think that this is one of the reasons, and one of the reasons so many people are on spiritual journeys today.
So, welcome to this very special dialogue between myself and Rupert Sheldrake, somebody who I've been a great admirer of for many years, since the 1980s. And you'll see behind me a few of his many books, along, Rupert, with some freshly picked flowers, because you and I are both lovers of the natural world, and we need to have that present in our thinking. And just to set a bit of background, this is the first of a series of dialogues with major thinkers and writers of our time who have been focusing on the necessary evolution of human consciousness so that we humans can become future fit to live on this planet in a way that makes a net positive contribution to the wider ecology. The series has been done jointly between the Weekend University and the Renewal Foundation, which I am part of. By generative dialogue, we take that term from somebody that Rupert knew well, and I was also a great admirer of, David Bohm, who talks about a dialogue that generates a third understanding because we together walk with open hearts to the learning edge, at the edge of both of our thinking. And in this series, we're going to particularly look at some of the past writers that have looked at how do we move from a materialistic, mechanistic, reductive way of thinking to a way of seeing the world as an evolving process rather than a world of separate things, and to focus in on the systemic interrelatedness of all life, from the cosmological of the universe right down to the smallest particle and wave. And we'll be exploring some of the kind of linking ideas that inform this stream that goes, perhaps, Rupert, you might add others to this, but from William James, Henri Bergson, through A.N. Whitehead and Owen Barfield, to more recent people like yourself, Gregory Bateson, David Bohm, and then to people writing now, Ian McGilchrist, Nora Bateson, Peter Senge, Bernardo Kastrup, Mark Vernon, and Matt Siegel, who's a great writer about A.N. Whitehead. So with that as a context, it would be lovely just to welcome you, Rupert, and if you could briefly just share for those people who are new to your work something about how you came to the whole theories of morphic fields and formative causation, and the notion that evolution happens not through chance or natural selection, but through habit formation.
Well, I started out doing research at Cambridge on the development of plants. My background was in biochemistry and botany and physiology. And I was working on the still unsolved problem of biological morphogenesis. How does more form come from less? How does a seed, an acorn, grow into an oak tree? The usual answer, of course, then as now, is that it's all genetically programmed. But I was teaching biochemistry at Cambridge, and I knew what genes did, which is code for proteins. They don't code for the shape of a leaf. They don't code for the shape of an acorn or the way that plants grow. They code for proteins, and some code for the control of protein synthesis. So the question of form was elusive, and although we knew that many of the chemicals that were involved in growth regulation, including the plant hormone auxin, which I worked on myself, it was still a problem. I got interested in the idea of morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields, an idea introduced into biology in the 1920s, a kind of holistic concept of fields that shape form that is like a blueprint. It's not about just the genes, it's a more top-down kind of causation. Then I was interested in how they might be inherited, and I was stuck for a year or two. I couldn't see how they could be inherited through the genes, and I couldn't see any other way they could be inherited until I read, for me, a seminal book, Matter and Memory by Henri Bergson, the philosopher. And Bergson argues in that book that memory is not stored in brains and is not material, but involves a kind of causation working across time. And that planted the seed of the idea that then germinated into the idea of morphic resonance, the idea there's a kind of collective memory in nature, that organisms are shaped by habits of form and habits of instinct, that all of nature is essentially habitual, that so-called laws of nature are more like habits. And I didn't feel I could write about this because I knew it was very radical and so on. I had to stand back for a while. I took a job in India working in an agricultural research institute. And then some years later, I wrote my first book on the subject, A New Science of Life. And since then, that was in 1981, it was published. Since then, I've been very much engaged in research on more holistic aspects of biology, morphic resonance, development in plants and animals, the extended mind, the mind beyond the brain, and the things that really interest me most are empirical tests that show that how we can go beyond the limited mechanistic materialist view that still dominates the sciences. So my main interest all along has been in experiments and experimental tests, rather than in purely theoretical developments.
Mm. And so these key notions of morphic resonance and morphic fields shaping form. And it'd be quite nice just to look at how that links to another person you quote besides Henri Bergson, A.N. Whitehead, sort of about the same time as Bergson, who talks about, you talk about inherited memory coming through the morphic field, and he talks about prehension, how nothing from the past is lost, but we experience it not just at the personal level from our personal past, but from social and cultural past. And can you say a little bit about how you might see the connection of those two? Or
well, I find Whitehead a very helpful philosopher, and part of his, I confess, I find it really hard to understand some of his books, like Process and Reality. The one that I've found most easy to read and understand is Science and the Modern World. And basically what he's arguing there is that at every level of nature, we have organisms, not machines. Even atoms and molecules are kind of tiny organisms, and living organisms are really organisms, not machines. And even large things like galaxies are organisms. So it's an organismic view of nature, which I think is the only reasonable view of understanding how things are put together and how they work together. In terms of prehensions, the idea is similar to that of morphic resonance. I personally find the morphic resonance easier to understand and communicate because Whitehead is often obscure. But basically it boils down to the same kind of idea, as you say, that the past influences what's happening in the present. And there's a kind of collective memory in each species. This is somewhat similar to Jung's idea of the collective unconscious in humans, except that from the morphic resonance point of view, everything has a collective memory, not just humans, or at least every self-organizing system.
Yeah, so let me just draw that out a little, because one of the things I've written quite a lot about is a kind of systemic view of which you also talk about, which is of we all live within nested systems, from the right down to the smallest particle through the atom, the cell, the molecule, the organ, the living organism of a creature, part of a social organism, a family, a community, yes, a wider nation state, perhaps, a species, a planet, right the way up to the cosmos. And the notion that each of those systems that we are nested within are also nested within us. So what I call the theory of reverse nesting. Yeah. So that everything we partake in, so the ecology isn't something out there, it's something that flows through us. Yes, there is a two-way influence. And I think you mentioned this I've been rereading your book on the presence of the past. And you also seem to have that notion of we're not just having morphic self-resonance, which you talk about, how we stay the same even though every cell of our body changes every few years, but also how we are influenced by the morphic fields of all this nested hierarchy. So perhaps you could just say a bit about that and how you see this notion of nested systems and reverse nesting.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by reverse nesting. I mean, when you say that it's easy for me to understand we're in the galaxy, but it's less easy for me to understand how the galaxy is in us, except through its influences on us through the solar system.
Well, let's bring it down to the family, right? I often jokingly say that when I look in the shaving mirror in the morning, I think, what's my father doing in the shaving mirror? He's died 15 years ago, but I find myself in if I see videos of myself, I see movements that I have that are my father still living in me. So the family and the past families live through us because the systems that's a system we're nested within, but actually also lives within us. The same way as our culture. Our culture is, I often say, because I do a lot of work with organizations, it's no good asking someone to tell you about their organizational culture because they are swimming within it. And the Chinese phrase, the last one to know about the sea is the fish. But it's part of how they start to see the world. It's part of how they make sense of things and speak. We absorb it because it flows through us.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with that. I think we are immersed in social fields. I would call them the morphic fields of social groups, including families. And of course, our culture flows through us. None of us invented the English language. We participate in it ever since we've learned to speak. And that's true of all languages, of course. I think the place where the influence of the past shines out most interestingly is in family constellation therapy. My wife has been practicing she's called Jill Peirce.
I know. I met her many years ago when she was doing her voice workshops.
She started with that, and then she still does that, but she now does family constellation work. And in a family constellation workshop, a great deal of it is about uncovering patterns within the family, not just the individual. And why it's so important, I think, is that it turns out that if there are problems, say somebody is suicidal or dysfunctional or they somehow reject their family, it often turns out that in a previous generation, somebody was rejected by the family or excluded or was suicidal or committed suicide. And there's a sense in which, in the present generation, someone takes up that role of the excluded person. And individual psychotherapy is fairly powerless to deal with this. I mean, you can go lie on a Freudian couch for years and talk about your dreams, but the fact is it's to do with the pattern within the family and the role you've taken up quite unconsciously in most cases. And so healing the family field is what this family constellation therapy is about. Usually involves finding out who was excluded in a previous generation, then picking people to represent the members of the previous generation and bringing somebody in to represent the excluded person to complete the field, to heal the family in the past, as it were, retrospectively. And this has an astonishing healing effect, not always, but sometimes has a very amazing healing effect. And this is all about memories within the family field, which we're part of, but not aware of usually.
Yeah, my original training was in psychotherapy and mental health, and I have worked with constellations and done the similar work to your wife. And I think I'm also done that within organizations. So again, organizational disturbances in the culture of an organization and what happened in its early phase can get echoed down the generations.
Yes, a very important point. I've never worked with organizations. Jill has to some extent, but I'm sure the same principles apply, and you must have had many experiences of this.
Mm. And I think you could also say that then the other one you mentioned just now, nations carry some of their history. So the whole issues of what is in the British cultural history is still being carried somewhere, whether that is in a loss of an empire or it's to do with shame about colonization. In different ways, those reverberations, those resonances are still with us. Would that make sense to you?
Oh, very much so. Yes, very much so. And I think that one of the things we see in these rather toxic right-wing nationalist movements at the present time is people in a rather incoherent way trying to relate to national history, but in a way that's not particularly helpful. I think we need to find more helpful ways of doing it.
Yes. So you, in that polarization, you probably have people who are carrying from the, if you like, the morphic field of the country. Some are carrying the grief of loss of identity and loss of empire and greatness, and others are carrying the shadow of the shame of what the shadow side of what happened through British empire colonization of the world, both what we did to other countries, but what we did to the ecology. And if you like, that then gets polarized and enacted in the current.
Yes, I think that's true. One of the things I'm most interested in at the moment is the big trauma in our national psyche here in all over Britain, really through the Protestant Reformation, when there was a huge break with what had gone before. In the Middle Ages, there were great cathedrals, the monasteries, and then that disruption that happened in the 1530s. The monasteries were dissolved, pilgrimage was suppressed, and the whole basis of people's religious life and the cohesion that provided was broken up. And I think we're still suffering from many of the consequences of that. So there are many traumas that have happened nationally. One of the ways in which I think we can do something practically about that is through the revival of pilgrimage. And I know that this is a subject you're interested in too. I was one of the founders of the British Pilgrimage Trust. And our point was that, until recently, most people who wanted to go on a pilgrimage thought, well, pilgrimage, the Camino Santiago. I think that's a wonderful thing. But we have many holy places here in Britain as well. And the point of the British Pilgrimage Trust was you can actually do it here. And the fact that most people haven't done it here is historically because in 1538, pilgrimage was banned. It was made illegal in England by Thomas Cromwell's injunction against pilgrimage. And it's only recently that it's been coming back. And the British Pilgrimage Trust in the last 10 years has reopened hundreds of ancient footpath routes. And a very significant step occurred recently when the new Archbishop of Canterbury, the first woman to occupy that role, decided to walk as a pilgrim from London to Canterbury. It took her 5 or 6 days to take up her role as Archbishop. And the historical resonances were made particularly strong. She invited me and a few other people to walk with her on the first bit of the pilgrimage. And it started with a service in St. Paul's Cathedral, where at the high altar, the Dean blessed the pilgrim staff that she was carrying and that of her husband, who was walking with her, with holy water. And then a group of us walked across the Millennium Bridge to Southwark Cathedral, where she was blessed to begin the pilgrimage to Canterbury, the traditional place from which people started, including the pilgrims in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And the Dean of Southwark, in carrying out this blessing, said that he was using the same words and the same Bible readings that were used on the same spot for the previous archbishop who'd walked there as a pilgrim in 1170, and that was Thomas Becket. And so there's this an extraordinary historical resonance, you see, of the present archbishop walking in the footsteps of Thomas Becket, one of the most famous archbishops of Canterbury in history, who was, of course, martyred in his cathedral. And this opening of these old pathways, this reconnecting with these traditions and the holy places is, I think, a very important thing to happen. And it's a very powerful thing to do. And one of the things that in the British Pilgrimage Trust we're doing is seeing now how does this apply to these other social issues, immigration, people living here who come from very different social and cultural backgrounds. Well, one of the things we think is that if people who've immigrated to Britain are going to become British, it's very important to relate to the land, because it's the land that shapes us all. It shaped our history as British people right back from, between the ice ages when people lived here, and after the ice age there were hunter-gatherers. Then there were the first farmers who built the great stone circles like Stonehenge, and then there were invasions of Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, and then the Norman conquest, the Middle Ages, and so on. All of this history has depended and been shaped by the actual land. And many immigrants, when they think about nature, they think about their village in Jamaica or their ancestral village in Gujarat or their village in Nigeria or wherever they come from. And so their sense of connection with nature is not here in Britain. Most of them live in cities and don't go into the countryside much. If you walk in the countryside, you don't meet many people of immigrant background. So what we're doing is encouraging people from immigrant groups to go on pilgrimages in England, which connect them with the land, the holy places, and the heritage. And I think this can have a healing effect. And we've found that it actually does so.
It's interesting because you talked about the work of your wife. Well, my wife recently retired, but she started a whole charity. She was also a psychotherapist. Called Trauma Foundation Southwest, which was dealing with very, very highly traumatized asylum seekers. And one of the things that she discovered through that work is that often their connection back to their place of origin is through the food and through the food they still eat. And so there may be ways, we had some of them come here and work in our vegetable walled garden. And grow their own food. So there may be something about how they bring the food from their past place onto a pilgrimage in the new land that they now are taking root in.
Well, that's an interesting idea. I suppose the most direct thing would be growing the food they're used to, but some of it being tropical, I'm not going to do too well with yams in the average allotment.
Well, of course, with global warming, it's amazing how many things you can still, particularly with polytunnels, you can grow.
Yes.
And I think, that whole notion of how the food from many of the other countries we intermingle with have flown into Britain. And indeed, sort of curry became popularized by Queen Victoria by taking lots of different Indian food cultures and bringing them together.
Well, of course, our diet's already heavily influenced by imported plants. I mean, potatoes from South America, chilies, peppers. So much of our food is actually part of a global movement of food and plants,
which you and I have seen change dramatically in our own lifetime. Having been, children just after the Second World War, where our diet became very constricted and then gradually has opened and opened, greatly improved. Within this, if we link this back to nested system, there's something about I wrote a book with my wife on integrative psychotherapy, and in that I was looking at why, with the world getting richer and healthier physically, why was there such an enormous growth in mental illness? And I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. And one of the areas I explored in that is our loss of groundedness in a family, an extended family, in a holding community, connection to land, connection to shared rituals, beliefs. When you and I were young, there were no shops open on Sunday. We still celebrated, I don't know if you did at school, but we did May Day, dancing around the maypole, the Harvest Festival. There were rhythms of the year, rhythms of the week, rhythms of the day. And now we've seen all those kind of psychological holding structures being fragmented.
No, I agree. And I think this fragmentation has mainly happened for people who are native Europeans. The thing is that most immigrant groups, most Indian Hindus, retain their customs, their festivals. Most Jewish people, even if they're atheists, still observe the festivals. Many Muslims, the majority of Muslims, observe the festivals and their traditional practices. Christianity is the only religion which has sort of destroyed itself from within. It's the only one that's pulled down the pillars of its own temples, as it were. And it's the only religion that generates atheism on an industrial scale. And there are a variety of reasons for this, but I think that this loss of Christian faith among the native European populations, which has happened progressively over the last few generations, has left people without these traditional rituals, traditional festivals, liturgical year, the structuring of time, rites of passage, and indeed without the sense of connection with a greater spiritual world or reality. And a lot of people, I think, are trying to rediscover that, which is why there are many people who call themselves spiritual but not religious. But the interesting thing is that the Enlightenment in Europe and North America, but much more so in Europe, involved a deliberate rejection of the Christian tradition. People like Voltaire were witheringly anti-Christian. People like T.H. Huxley, who built up so much of the culture of professional science, were passionately anti-Christian. And we see that tradition continue today in people like Richard Dawkins, who equate science with atheism. So I think that this loss of sense of connection is not true of all cultures. It's not true of most of the world. Certainly not true of India today. It's not true of Africa today or of South America today. It's a characteristic of mainly Western Europe. And I think that this has led to this sense of disconnection from the world of the spirit, from God, from the festivals, from the rituals, from the holy places. And so I think this is, it's historically an interesting phenomenon. I myself think that one of the ways forward is through not emphasizing so much that it's all about belief, because I don't think it's all about belief. I think it's all about practice, which is why I've written my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, which I see placed beside you, yes. And its sequel, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. Both books are about spiritual practices, and what they show is that scientific research has shown that a whole range of spiritual practices make people happier, healthier, and live longer. They're good for you. So spiritual practices like fasting, prayer, meditation, the practice of gratitude, singing and chanting with other people, taking part in rituals, going on pilgrimages, connecting with nature. All these kinds of practices give people a greater sense of connection and therefore a greater sense of belonging and a more satisfying life, less sense of alienation, disconnection, separation, and all the things that underlie so much modern mental problems, especially depression.
I think, Rupert, that somewhere in it you say that atheism should come with a health warning.
Yes, well, at least militant atheism, because insofar as militant atheism alienates people from their traditional religious practices, it really does cause health problems. Because, if spiritual and religious practices make people happier, healthier, and live longer, for which there's a huge amount of evidence, then lack of these practices makes them less healthy, live shorter, and less happy. So that's why I think it really should come with a health warning. The problem is that most educated people, as you and I would have experienced growing up, have been filled with this Enlightenment agenda, which is hard baked into the educational system, which is that to be an atheist, or at least an agnostic, means that you're smarter than people who have any kind of religious faith. They've been bamboozled, duped, they're credulous, feeble-minded, etc. Whereas we who believe in science and reason have risen above all that, seen through it, and we're smarter. And most people undergo that kind of transition as a teenager if they've been brought up in a religious family. And I meet endless people who say, I saw it through it all when I was about 14 and, I just saw through it. And they are rather proud of the fact that at 14, they absorbed a kind of cultural norm of the educated classes. They think it shows they're smarter than everybody else. Or they say they had some stupid religious education teacher who put them off. Well, no one applies that to science. They don't say I had a terrible science teacher, so I'm against science. Or I've never looked at anything scientific again in my whole life because I saw through how limited science was when I was a child. Or I saw through the problems with the justice system, so I've had no truck with law and order. It's a specific thing, a cultural thing in our culture about religion, and specifically about the Christian religion. So anyway, I think that this is one of the reasons, and one of the reasons so many people are on spiritual journeys today, because this cultural movement, which has been going on since the Enlightenment, and has been propagated through the Enlightenment-based educational system, has now become the norm. In Britain, only about 5% of people go to church on Sundays, and less than half more than half say they have no religion. So I think this is part of our cultural condition at the moment.
So let me just take that forward with you, if I can, in two ways. What is, I'm quite interested, having read, your more recent books on spiritual practices, but also your more scientific books, and following, your life story of how you went through your atheist phase, having been brought up, was it Methodist, I think?
Well, Methodist and Anglican. I went to a very high church boarding school and had a Methodist family, so I had both traditions.
You had both. And then you went through your own atheist phase, and then kind of gradually went through a number of spiritual teachers from Sufism, Buddhism, others, and then the major influence was Father Bede Griffiths, and I'm just interested in how you connect your kind of spiritual journey and explorations with your scientific ones, and how do you see the two informing each other?
Well, first of all, if one believes in mechanistic materialism, which I was brought up with as a scientist, then there's no role for religion at all, or very little, because it's thoroughly going atheistic. The universe is made of mindless matter, and evolution is purposeless. There's no consciousness out there unless it's in little green men on other planets and lower levels in animals on Earth. But basically, consciousness is confined to the inside of brains on the Earth. The rest of the universe is totally unconscious and purposeless. Now, if one believes that, which is built into the foundations of science, and which I discuss in my book, The Science Delusion, which I'm pleased to see is right there behind you, where I deal with the 10 dogmas of mechanistic materialism. If one believes that, then it's hard to find any link to spiritual traditions. But what for me started was a questioning of this dogmatic foundation of science and the need for a more holistic kind of science, just for scientific reasons. When I thought of morphic resonance and got interested in the Whitehead's theory of nature, the organic view of nature, a more holistic approach, this was not driven by any religious motive. In fact, I wasn't religious at all when this happened. I got interested in religious traditions through taking LSD in the 1970 or 71. Then I got interested in the mind and took up transcendental meditation. Then I got interested in yoga and in Hindu philosophy. And then I went and worked in India because I was so interested in Indian philosophy. So it was really through the Indian tradition that I became aware of the realms of spiritual reality, consciousness beyond the human level. So in India, I accepted the Hindu view, very common view in India, that all religions point towards a union, a consciousness beyond the human level, which we can experience through mystical experiences. But each religion interprets it in its own way. Father Bede Griffiths, who was my main teacher, compared it to the palm of the hand, that if the sense of being part of something vastly greater than ourselves, the mystical experience lies at the heart of all religions. Buddha was enlightened by meditating, sitting under a peepal tree. The Hindu sages meditated in caves in the Himalayas and had these experiences. Jesus was not, didn't reach his sense of his deep, profound connection with God the Father through studying in a seminary. It came to him in a moment of his baptism through a mystical enlightenment type experience. So there's this experience, but then each finger is like a different cultural translation of this into languages and cultural traditions. So each religion seems separate. They have their own characteristics, but they all have a common basis. Now, I think that's a very reasonable view, and it's the one I take myself. But then I realized, partly on the basis of my own theory of morphic resonance, that since I'm English and I grew up in a Christian culture, in a Christian tradition, the path that's most suitable for me is, Christian and more specifically Anglican. So I'm not saying everyone in the world should become an Anglican Christian. I'm saying that for people who come from an English or Anglican background, the most natural way of finding a religious path that harmonizes with one's own tradition is one's own, unless there's a strong reason to reject it and become a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Sufi or whatever. So I think that's, for me, the default position. And I'm sure if I'd been brought up in Thailand, I'd be a Buddhist, and if I'd been brought up in Egypt, I'd be a Muslim. So I'm certainly not a Christian triumphalist, but I think that those of us from a Christian background do well to integrate our own tradition. And personally, I don't experience much conflict between, if any, between my religious practice and my scientific ideas.
And yes, your lovely metaphor, Madam Bede Griffiths. It's a bit like Matthew Fox talking about one light, many lanterns, or one source, many rivers. Yes, it's actually finding, and what I feel a fellow traveler with you on is the notion that the need to find religion through practice, not through cognitive argument or belief. Because it's, as you show in the book Science and Spiritual Practices, the practices go across different beliefs and are deeper level than that of language and conceptual formulation.
Absolutely. I mean, what a study of spiritual practices shows is that they're common to practically all religions. All religions have pilgrimage. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and shamanic hunter-gatherer societies have their song lines going to the great traditional sacred places. So this is very deep in human nature. And The practice of gratitude is encouraged by all religions and has been shown by positive psychologists that even when done in a non-religious or non-spiritual framework, just counting your blessings or thinking of things you're grateful for has a measurable effect on happiness and the sense of connection. Fasting is in all religious traditions, singing and chanting in all traditions, so meditation and prayer. So these practices, again, are they're the basis of all religion. The belief systems, which have been put in the foreground, partly in Christian history by various conflicts between different groups with different ideas, and partly by the rise of atheism, where atheists treat the whole thing as if it's just a matter of belief, and religion's just a matter of stupid beliefs, gives a very distorted view of what's really going on, because most people who are religious in any tradition, in any culture, are not primarily concerned with beliefs. They're concerned with the community, the tradition, the rites of passage, and so forth.
I wonder, Ripper, also that another bridge is, and when you talk about what happened in the Reformation and the loss of pilgrimage and the banning of it and the loss of practice, that in many ways from the Reformation we did lose an experiential-based religion, and it became the religion of the word as opposed to the deeper sense of logos or experience. And that's true about your scientific work. You say we don't use a kind of empirical, experiential way of looking at the beliefs of science. So your emphasis on going back to our direct experience kind of bridges the two worlds.
Well, I think it does, yes. And I think you're right. The Reformation, which happened soon after the invention of the printing press in Europe, which meant that people could have books in abundance, and the Bible was translated into English and other languages. Before that, in the Middle Ages, monks and people were reading the Bible in Latin. The Roman Catholic services, until quite recently, were in Latin. So for most people going to them, it was a right brain experience. It wasn't about exact meaning of this particular text. It was a right brain experience of sort of clouds of incense, chanting, beautiful stained glass windows, rituals and so forth. Now, I think in science, the belief system of materialism is a belief system, and the belief that matter's unconscious, that nature's purposeless, that the mind's nothing but the brain or the activity of the brain, that biological inheritance is all in genes and possibly some epigenetic modifications of them. These are beliefs that memory is stored in the brain. These are not firmly based on evidence, although most people assume they are. They're a belief system, which is why I think that science would be better taught and experienced if it did start from experience. And one person historically who emphasized that very strongly was Goethe. And in Goethe, we have he was a poet as well as a scientist. And Goethe said, well, if you want to understand plants, then look at plants. Look at them, think about the leaves, the petals, how you see them, how you can see their transformation from one structure to another. And it gives a deeper understanding through experience, whereas the first thing that you do in a current plant sciences degree is put the plant in a blender, grind it up, and then extract enzymes or DNA or something from it. So, in modern biological education, apart from the nature table in the reception class in primary schools, once you've got beyond reception, it's all about learning how the heart's a pump. The lungs are like bellows. We're made of enzymes and DNA. And instead of looking at the sky and learning the names of the planets and the constellations by direct experience, it's a matter of looking at pictures of spaceships and diagrams of mathematical equations about planets and so on. So the experiential basis of science has been largely removed from our educational system and indeed from the practice of science. Although, ironically, science is all supposed to be based on the empirical method, and empirical means experience.
Yes. One of the things that we're doing in the Renewal Foundation, we have a woodland where I live that was planted by 1,000 children in 2005. And we've twinned it with Ecuadorian rainforest, a certain particular part, which is where a lot of our clouds come from, because children learn about rainforests, but they learn about it through numbers and facts. So the idea is that they will be able to do a walk through a local woodland near a city and then do a virtual 360-degree video walk through the rainforest. And the Ecuadorian children will be able to do the opposite. So that we learn it through our bodies and our smell and our touch and our totally experientially, first of all, before we go into the conceptualization.
Well, thank goodness you're doing that. It's so important and so far away from the way science is taught in schools. You see, I think one of the problems, is that a lot of people, you and me, and lots of other people have sort of moved on from reductionistic, mechanistic science. But the way it's still taught to children in schools and in universities hasn't moved on. It's like almost unreconstructed. GCSE and A-level syllabus is like the science of 50 years ago, the kind of reductionistic materialism. And it's very hard to reform that system. I mean, I've had meetings with science teachers to discuss how it could be done more holistically. And what happens in the end is they all say, well, it's all wonderful to think about these things and stuff, but basically we've got the national curriculum. We've got to get our students through the exams for their sake. The schools ranked in the league tables of exam results. And so it's all about the syllabus, teaching to the syllabus, getting through the exam. It's nothing to do with experience and stuff. It ought to be. And true learning, it ought to be, but the present educational system doesn't have much space for that. The kinds of things where this can happen are mostly in the holidays or in the evenings or at weekends. They're not, I mean, maybe you've managed to get your thing into the school syllabus, but if so, that would be a tremendous achievement.
Well, it's rainforests are in the syllabus, but getting schools to then find the time to get the children out to actually experience living ecologies directly is still quite a battle. But before, because we're running short of time, I wanted to link it back to other in this stream of people, because I think if we are going to influence, there is something about this stream of people like yourself who have been holding aloft, if you like, the torch of moving beyond a reductive, materialistic way of seeing the world, atomistic way. And I want to just bring in two important ones, I think, because another person who came from a great scientific line, along with the Huxleys at Cambridge, was Gregory Bateson. And he also, and I don't know whether I've missed it in your writing, but he's another person who tried to find a way of understanding the world which was neither reductive and materialistic, nor based on superstition, and talks about the extended mind. He sees mind in interconnected relational fields. Yeah, so the mind is in action. It's in the connected circuits of mind. He talks about. And I'm just interested in that connection with your work. And then I'd like to go just briefly back to Whitehead and just talk about where I think there's a slight, well, I have a question reading you both side by side.
All right. Well, Bateson, I mean, I read his book, Steps to an Ecology of Mind, with much interest. And very much like his approach of the extended mind.
And then he has two follow-up books. One was published post his death, Mind in Nature, and then Where Angels Fear, because he was brought up by an atheistic scientific father. His grandfather was one of the first people to talk about genetics.
Yes.
And his father, though, very interestingly insisted that every morning they read the Bible out loud at breakfast, right, in front of pictures of William Blake's paintings, because he said, I think it's important that you understand all of this, even if it's you don't have to believe it factually. But a very interesting upbringing.
I see. I didn't know that. Well, you see, I think I was I must admit, slightly put off Bateson because I've taught for many years at the Esalen Institute in California, where he was a kind of demigod. He used to teach there, and there was a kind of Bateson cult there, and I just thought this was very good as far as it went. But I just felt that it didn't go far enough. And you see, I think what's happened now is that within the world of philosophy of mind, there are people who talk about the extended mind in much the same way Bateson did. For example, he says, blind man with his stick, the stick is like an extension of his body, and when he feels something with the end of the stick, his mind is somehow connected with the environment in a way that's not just through the skin and so on. There's an extension of the mind. Now, there are lots of people who say our minds are extended through machines, through computers, through smartphones, and so forth.
But you see, I think Bateson goes much further than that. He talks about, if there is he uses this analogy, it's one stage of a man cutting down a tree. And the problem about our grammar, he says, is that, I axing tree object, but actually mind is in the whole activity that connects the man, the axe, the swing, the tree, the movement of the tree. And that's all in a circuit of mind.
Well, I would agree with that. And that was taken further by people like Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson in the inactive theories of mind. But and so I've interacted with them as well. But where I have a problem there is I agree with all that. I don't have a problem with it. But I just think we need to go further. You see, as you know, I've done a lot of research on telepathy and on the sense of being stared at. And so, you see, when I had discussions with someone like Varela, who was very Batesonian, and I said, well, look, I'm interested, you're talking about the mind, the interaction, it's all all integrated, it's a circuit and so forth. Now, I said, well, I'm interested in the sense of being stared at. When you stare at someone from behind, if they can feel you looking at them, this mind reaching out isn't just a metaphor. There's some influence going out of the eyes that's touching them and influencing them in some way, and we don't know what that influence is. And it's not just a way of talking about it. There's some aspect of nature is not on the scientific map, and we need to include it. Well, Varela then got very angry and said, that's just superstition, it can't possibly happen, and so forth. And so one of the problems that I've had with in activists is that they say all these Batesonian things, but then you say, well, what about telepathy? I think of somebody, I intend to telephone them, I ring them up, and they say, that's funny, I was just thinking about you. Have they picked up my intention in advance? Well, I've done lots of research on telephone telepathy, and I'm sure it's real. We don't have time to go into all the experiments, but I've described in my book the sense of being stared at. I think that's not in your collection right there. Not visibly.
I have read it though. Your one's on both the stared at and the telepathy. So if I can, where I see, because I'm totally with you about how do we extend that beyond the here and now interactive extended mind.
Yes.
And this is where with Whitehead's notion of prehension, I think this does link across and links to this notion of nested systems. That, and you're talking of Jill Peirce's work with constellations, that we are picking up and sensing in many different ways beyond that which is just immediate in the here and now.
Oh, I think we are, yes. And I think we're also picking up things that are in the not here, but now, because I think telepathy is usually immediate. You know, a mother picks up when she's miles away from her baby, when the baby needs her. I'm doing research on mother-baby telepathy at the moment. It's definitely in the now, but it's not in the here. It's a telepathy, you know, distant feeling. It's the mind extended in space. Minds are extended in time, of course, through memory and connect us with the future, not only through desires, thoughts, intentions, but also precognitions. So I think one of the things that I think is very important is that if we're going to have a fuller view of the extended mind, that we actually take into account these psychic phenomena which have been taboo within the scientific world for generations, and which are still taboo among many holistic scientific thinkers, because even if they privately believe in them, they don't want to admit it in public because it gets you into trouble. I know it does because it's got me into lots of trouble. So they're right. It does get you into trouble. And if you want to avoid unnecessary trouble, don't mention telepathy. Don't mention psychic phenomena. And of course, don't mention religion. But so these things are, I think, are still taboos, even in the holistic community. And I think that actually, when you look at these modern new models of consciousness, say Michael Pollan, his new book, A World Appears, it's a very good overview of modern ideas about consciousness, the hard problem. It quotes Evan Thompson, probably Bateson, and so on. But there's not one mention of telepathy or psychic phenomena. And I know that Pollan knows about these things because I've talked to him about it. But he probably wisely decided that it would be best not to mention anything of this. Is okay, psychedelics are now okay. That would have been taboo a few years ago. But things are changing. But probably for self-protective reasons, or possibly the advice of his agent or publisher, he sees fit not to mention these things, not even to dismiss them. So I think we're still living, even in the more, what you and I might think of as the more enlightened scientific world that we're familiar with, these taboos are still there. So I think we've still got further to go.
Perhaps we should avoid the word enlightened because of its link to a particular phase in Western human history, but
exactly,
a
yes.
more open, experiential,
inclusive
yes. Period. Well, let me, because we're coming to the end, and it might be I'm just planting a seed for a future conversation. But when I try to reflect and go back and read your work and read it alongside, and I do have Process and Reality here. I know it famously is a book that 100 times more people start than finish.
I would say 1,000 times more, even
probably 1,000. I think the story goes that it was based on his lectures in Edinburgh, and 600 turned up to the first lecture, and only 12 turned up to the second. But I think and one of the people I'm going to talk with is Matt Siegel, because I think he's done a lot of making Whitehead more available. But I think I want to plant this seed because I think that his whole notions, both his panentheism, which is a term that's later applied to him, is very close to yours. I think the notion of prehension is. But I think, he has this famous phrase that all philosophy is footnotes to Plato, that he brings back in that although we inherit, and he would be quite I think, open to a lot of what you're saying, even about telepathy. He's also saying that what happens in each event is not just shaped by all that's come before, not just in the personal life, but in the collective life and evolution, that evolution is basically creative, which is what you also say, but is also shaped through consciousness by what he calls ingression, but the notion that there are what you would call archetypes, but what Plato calls eternal forms, what the Muslims call, the names of God. But these aren't fixed things, unlike Plato. He's not saying that they exist somewhere, as ideal forms, but they are what you would call probability structures, that there are, or what Waddington would call creodes. These are forms that, like, redness or triangulation, that are trinities, for instance, that actually pull us. So he talks about the lure of so almost an Aristotelian teleology. And it would be lovely to talk to you about that, because I think you write a lot about the formation from the past, but he's also almost talking about a pull from the future.
Yes, I like that side of Whitehead. I just wish he hadn't been so confusing. You see, by calling them eternal objects, and then by saying, well, they're not really eternal, it's sort of...
well, they're not objects.
They're not objects either. So
they are probability structures, I think, in your language.
Yes. Well, then, you see, that is one of the problems. That's why we need Matt Siegel, because Matt Siegel interprets Whitehead and makes Whitehead comprehensible in a way that Whitehead doesn't for himself. Whitehead requires interpreters in a way that Bergson doesn't. I mean, Bergson is actually... I'm more influenced by Bergson than Whitehead, partly because I came across him first. But he's more readable. And when I was developing the ideas of morphic resonance, I belonged to a group in Cambridge called the Epiphany Philosophers. And one of the leading figures was Dorothy Emmett, who was a student of Whitehead's. And the dominant philosopher of that whole group was Whitehead. So I was actually immersed in my 20s in a very Whiteheadian world. So I've assimilated a lot of Whitehead, I think, just by living in that kind of world, intellectual world. So I'm all in favor of Whitehead, but when it comes to the kinds of things what I spend hours thinking about at the moment, for example, is the connection between light and vision. Obviously, light and vision are closely related, but the sense of being stared at suggests to me that when we see something, we project the images out. The old idea of extramission of images, that the world we're seeing is out there, our images are all where they seem to be, projected out. And our consciousness and the images within our consciousness are very closely linked to light and to the electromagnetic field. And the sense of being stared at is a way of looking at this experimentally. But you see, when I'm thinking about that, Whitehead isn't much help, nor is anyone else, because apart from Plato and Euclid, most philosophers haven't really thought about this particular problem. And so when I'm dealing with the kind of leading edges of the research I'm doing, telepathy, morphic resonance, the sense of being stared at, are the main three areas that I'm experimentally investigating. And presentiment and precognition. I get to the point where no one's that helpful, because nobody understands what's going on in these areas, and we're on our own. And I like that feeling of being at the frontier of things, but I wish I could find a text in Whitehead that would help me understand this, but I haven't done. I have tried. I've tried asking Matt as well.
Let me then plant two seeds and then bring this to a close. One is, if you've not come across it, the 12th century writings of Ibn al-Arabi, who I think is by far the best Neoplatonic Sufi Islamist philosopher, who does talk a lot about light.
Yes.
Which we might have a conversation about at another occasion, Rupert. But also plant the seed that perhaps after I've done a session with Matt Siegel, that the three of us might get together and might start to look more deeply at the Whiteheadian. And the third one is just to say that I think probably one of the people who was very influenced by Whitehead was T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets.
Yes.
I think his poetic expression of Whiteheadian ideas is a great place for many people to start.
I agree. Oh, good. I love this plan. I'd be very happy to continue the conversation with Matt. And you said you wanted a kind of off-piece discussion, and that's what we seem to have had. So no, thank you. I'm very happy to continue. We could go on for hours.
But let me just perhaps end with a quote from A.N. Whitehead, which I think might be quite suitable. Philosophy begins in wonder, and at its end, when philosophic thought has done its best, the wonder remains.
Oh, I totally agree. Yes, that's a great quote. I hadn't heard that one before.
It comes from Modes of Thought, and his other important books. But thank you, Rupert. This has been marvelous, and I look forward, hopefully, to some further dialogue.
Good. Well, thank you, Peter.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month. And if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up via the link in the description.